those are the Clement and Ignatius and Polycarp are regarded as the three great apostolic fathers. If you make the list 4, you get Papias of Hierapolis. And a reason that Papias doesn't always make the list is apostolic fathers are people that were discipled by the apostles. Papias was almost certainly discipled by John, and who have writings that have been preserved down to this age. Papias only sort of qualifies. Ignatius quotes from him, Irenaeus quotes from him, and Eusebius, writing 2 centuries later in his ecclesiastical history, quotes extensively from Papias and sees him as a major authoritative source writing at the beginning of the 2nd century. That's all we've got from Papias. None of his writings have survived on their own, only in quotation in other places. But this is the part of the main street of Hierapolis, a city that's between Laodicea and Colossae, and not that far from Ephesus. And you can go see these ruins. Hierapolis is a great trip. It's near Pamukkale, where the hot springs are, and the White Cliffs. And it's a part of Turkey that is very, very well worth seeing. It's a pretty easy trip from Ephesus. And so if you want to do a biblical kind of a tour, I would greatly encourage you to consider the Pamukkale, Hierapolis, Ephesus trip. But Hierapolis was a large and prosperous Roman city, and Papias was the bishop or the leader of the church there. He's a very important chronicler of the early church. He wrote something called the Exposition of the Sayings of the Lord in 5 volumes. So we don't have the title page. We don't know what was all in there. But it's at least parts of it are exposition of parts of the Gospels and includes some material that Papias said that he got from John or other places that are not included in the 4 Gospels that we have. And Papias did write at some length, apparently, about the story of the woman caught in adultery, which of course is only in John's Gospel, and textual analysis types have, for a couple of centuries here, made the case that maybe that story is thrown in later or is not original to John. But Papias wrote about it as if it were an important story and it was really true. And it really happened, and John was really a witness about this, and that he'd really heard about it from John. So Papias wrote probably between about 95 AD and maybe 110 AD. Eusebius sees him as the great authority on the origins of the 4 Gospels. And he is likely the source of the first New Testament canon that we have. People talk about now what's called the Muratorian fragment, which is a fragmentary document that dates really only about to the 7th century, but comes from much earlier and is regarded as the first list that somebody made of the authoritative books for the New Testament. It is likely that comes from Papias. That list does not have Hebrews or James or 1st and 2nd Peter or 3rd John on it. And it does have something called the Apocalypse of Peter and something called the Wisdom of Solomon. So it's not the final canon that we have settled on of 27 books of the New Testament, but it's pretty close. Irenaeus called Papias an ancient man who was a hearer of John and a companion of Polycarp. That was writing in AD 180. Papias also apparently was friends with or had contact with the daughters of Philip the Evangelist, at least a couple of them, because he used information that he said he got from them in his writing. He may have also met Philip the Evangelist. but little or nothing is known of Papias' life and ministry. Eusebius criticizes Papias for his, quote, limited understanding, unquote, which is primarily because Papias takes a pretty literalist view of Scripture, and Eusebius wants a little broader view of Scripture in a more allegorical kind of a sense. But one thing that we do have from Papias is a piece of the preface that he wrote to his 5 volumes. And it says, I shall not hesitate also to put into ordered form for you, along with the interpretations, everything that I learned carefully in the past from the elders and noted down carefully, for the truth of which I vouch. For unlike most people, I took no pleasure in those who told many different stories, but only in those who taught the truth. Nor did I take pleasure in those who reported their memory of someone else's commandments, but only in those who reported their memory of the commandments given by the Lord to the faith and proceeding from the truth itself. And if by chance anyone who had been in attendance on the elders arrived, I made inquiries about the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter had said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any of the other Lord's disciples, and whatever Aristion and John the elder, the Lord's disciples, were saying. For I did not think that information from the books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving voice. Now, Aristion is the name that you're thinking, who was that? Aristion was the bishop of Smyrna before Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna at the turn from the 1st century to the 2nd century. So Papias says that he worked very hard in writing about the church and writing about what we believe, to make sure that he was consulting people who had been there or people who had spoken to those who had been there. And so Papias left a mark that was a big deal to Eusebius. Papias's writings, some of Papias's writings apparently survived well into the Middle Ages. There are people writing almost 800 years on who say that they've read Papias and they're making comments about that. So for hundreds and hundreds of years, copies of Papias's writings existed, but sometime after the end of the first millennia, those were lost or destroyed, and we no longer have any of that. So those are the men that are known as the Apostolic Fathers, the men who were discipled by some of the apostles, primarily by John. Clement of Rome is probably discipled by Peter, but the others of these are all members of the cohort of men that John the apostle invested himself in. So another story that goes at this time, next slide, is the story of Thecla. So this is, on the left hand here, you've got Paul. You can see the beard and the receding hairline, and there's a woman. The woman is Thecla. So who knows the story of Thecla? The top right is Thecla with lions. The bottom right is Thecla listening to Paul from her, it's supposedly from her window. It looks like she's from her tower, but it should be from her window. The document that this all comes from is called the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And the Acts of Paul and Thecla is a 2nd century document. And it's probably part of a larger collection called the Acts of Paul, which were not written during Paul's lifetime, but were written within a century or so thereafter. The text, the Acts of Thecla and Paul, the source is unknown, but it dates to at least AD 180 and maybe earlier. But the story takes place more than a century before that. Some parts of the Acts of Paul are dated to AD 160 or maybe a little bit earlier. I must point out that Tertullian, writing in about AD 190, called the Acts of Paul and Thecla a fraud. And it is not known if there is actually a real person behind this story. However, by the 5th century, the Acts of Thecla and Paul was available in a pocket-sized book that you could carry with you anywhere. There are some of those from Egypt that have survived. It became, the Acts of Thecla and Paul became basically the first paperback book in all of history.
Bought at CVS.
That you could buy, at many different places. And Thecla, the story of Thecla, inspired and changed the lives of many thousands of Christians during the patristic era. In fact, Thecla was the most influential woman associated with the church in the first 5 centuries of the church, other than Mary, the mother of Jesus. And that's a pretty close call, actually. As much as you think of Mary as a very major character, in the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries, Thecla is just as big of a deal and just as big of an influence on the church. So, what is the story of Thecla? So here's how the story goes. Thecla is born in Iconium around AD 30. Iconium up in what is now central Turkey. She is a virgin betrothed to a man. She's from a wealthy and influential family. She's made a good match. Her mother has made a good match for her with a man from a young man from a prominent and wealthy family. And so she has all the things going for her in life. And this guy Paul comes to Iconium on either his first missionary journey or his second missionary journey. So this is late 40s, early 50s. She is maybe 17, maybe 20, something like that. And Paul is staying at a house in Iconium where he is preaching every day, all day long. And Thecla lives next door. And Thecla, for 3 days, sits in the window of her room, refusing to eat or drink or anything else, and is mesmerized by the words of Paul coming from next door. Paul preaching and teaching. And she is super strongly influenced by Paul's words on chastity and virginity. And you can see some of the stuff that he wrote in 1 Corinthians. As a result of this 3 days of listening to Paul from her window in Iconium, Thecla rejects her fiancé and says she will never marry, rejects the authority of her mother, and says that she will follow Paul. Her mother is so scandalized by this, as is her fiancé, that they take Thecla before the authorities and have Paul arrested as well and have them tried. Paul is beaten and cast out of the city. Okay, that's reasonably consistent with Acts, sort of. And Thecla is sentenced to death for her rebellion against her mother and her fiancé, and sentenced to be burned at the stake. And as they take her out to burn her at the stake and are about to, they tie her to the stake and they start the fire, a gigantic rainstorm comes through and puts out the fire. And it's accompanied by hail, which is so large that many of the people who are present are killed by hailstones. And the whole crowd flees and disperses. Thecla is released. She leaves the city and finds Paul, who is with a small group of his followers in a cave outside the city. Paul tells her that it's a little early for her to be baptized into the faith, that she's young and beautiful and she might fall into temptation. So he wants to slow this thing down. But she ends up following Paul to Antioch of Pisidia, which is on his following trip back towards Antioch of Syria, where he's based out of. In Antioch of Pisidia, a young nobleman sees her, thinks she's beautiful and wonderful, comes after her, and eventually basically grabs hold of her and says, I have to marry you, you have to marry me, you're the one and only one, the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. She rejects him, and he makes a complaint against her, which causes her to be cast into the arena to the wild beasts. However, in the arena with the wild beasts, the lionesses are loyal to Thecla, and the lionesses protect her from all the other animals. Okay, so there's loyalty there. There is in the arena a pool of aggressive killer seals. I'm not sure where you get those. Anyway, but Thecla, desiring to be baptized, casts herself into the pool with the killer seals and baptizes herself. The seals respect this, of course. They do not harm her. And Thecla, having escaped death again, is released again and follows Paul. Paul is in Myra now, and she goes to Myra and reports back into Paul about all this, and tells him that she has baptized herself. Paul is okay with that, and commissions her for independent ministry. Now, he's mostly putting people out, kind of in pairs and teams and stuff, but he commissions her for independent ministry. She returns to Iconium and finds that her fiancé has died, perhaps of a broken heart, and preaches the gospel there for some time, and then apparently goes to Seleucia in the northern part of what is now Turkey, and lives in a cave, reportedly for 72 years, and then maybe leaves Seleucia and goes to a mountain town called Maalula in Syria, and along the way she does miracles and lives under great persecution. Eventually a mob of young men is sent after her. She calls out to God. They've trapped her in her cave. God opens the wall in the side of the cave, and she flees into the wall, and the wall closes behind her, and the young men pursuing her are left with only a piece of her veil. And so she is entombed in the mountain, except there's a tomb of Thecla in Turkey and a tomb of Thecla in Syria, and two tombs of Thecla in different places in Cyprus, and the remains of Thecla are held by a cathedral in Rome. So she's buried in 5 places. In any case, this was a hugely influential story from the middle of the 2nd century. Whether it is true or not, people treated it that way for centuries in the church. This became a model for empowerment of women in the church. It caused many women in the early church to choose not to marry, to choose to pursue God, to believe that Thecla, having twice rejected a good marriage, a marriage to a wealthy and prominent man where there was money and security, was a sign that holy women perhaps should not marry at all. Now, the Acts of Paul and Thecla as a story really doesn't indicate that that's true. Thecla is helped by a number of married people, and those people receive blessings. Okay, so it's not a diatribe against marriage, but Thecla's choice to not be married was hugely influential to many women over the next several centuries. Thecla was a big influence on several famous early female martyrs. Eugenia of Rome was martyred in AD 258. Presented herself as basically a disciple of Thecla and made Thecla her model in life. This is probably the first significant influence toward the idea of female monasticism. I mean, not only does Thecla twice reject marriage, but she goes and lives in a cave. She lives in poverty and in very great minimalism. And Thecla, the story of Thecla influenced at least some women to consider independent ministry. There is evidence that over the next several centuries there were a number of bands of women, young women, who traveled around the Roman Empire preaching the gospel because Thecla had traveled around preaching the gospel. So she became an early model of a truly committed Christian woman. There's a Roman Catholic parish on the south side of Boston that is St. Thecla. I mean, that's in this neighborhood, okay, basically. There is a city in Canada which is named for Thecla. There's a city in El Salvador which is named for Thecla. There are at least a dozen cathedrals and monasteries around the world that are named for Thecla today. Here's the thing that is almost certainly true. One of the minor characters in the story of Thecla is Queen Tryphena. Queen Antonia Tryphena of Thrace was living in retirement in a city south of Troas at the time that the story of Thecla is set. She was supported by the emperor. Her brother was the client king of Pontus and Cappadocia, and her brother married the sister of Agrippa II, Bernice. The Bernice from Acts that Paul was tried in front of. Her brother is believed, through Bernice, to have converted to Judaism and probably later to Christianity. And Antonia Tryphena might be the person that is referred to in Romans 16, verse 12. Tryphena and Tryphosa. Nobody knows who Tryphosa was. So, the Acts of Thecla, well, it's probably not all true. May not be almost any of it true. But the details are right. Iconium's in the right place, the cities are in the right place, the roads go the right places, and Antonia Tryphena is a real person. So we don't know, but Thecla is hugely influential in the early church. As a story of an empowered young woman who followed the gospel, made her own choices, and sacrificed the things that people around her thought were good and necessary in order to serve the cause of the gospel. And she left a mark. Even if she didn't exist, she left a mark that endured for centuries in the church. And one other thing I want to say about the story of Thecla, and that is the Acts of Thecla and Paul, or Paul and Thecla, really presents Paul in a very bad light, okay? Paul is a very ascetic guy. He discourages marriage and childbearing. He's just that piece of his writings. There's nothing about Paul that is pro-family or any of that. And the thing about the story of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, Paul is never around when he's needed. Okay? In the story, Paul is always off camera when Thecla is in crisis. Whenever she needs something, he's not around. She has to pray and wait on God and have something miraculous happen. And then she goes and reports back to Paul, and Paul says something, but then she goes back out and she gets into some other huge peril, and Paul is once again not around. And Paul, throughout the story, is thronged by young women. He is this guy that, young women are always coming around and wanting to hear stuff. And there's like a comet tale of young women coming after him. And of course, he doesn't baptize Thecla after her conversion, so she does it herself. He commissions Thecla to independent ministry, but gives her almost no training, provides only shows up only occasionally to provide advice or assistance. So Paul doesn't look particularly well in this story. It does, however, include an early description of Paul, a physical description. High forehead, long nose, crooked legs, and kind of the broad sort of single eyebrow thing, all of which are things that we generally think are probably true of the way that Paul really looked. So the Acts of Thecla, the story of Thecla, hugely influential, probably not all true, maybe mostly not true, but the impact changed tens of thousands of lives. One of the most influential women of the church in the patristic era. So, and an explanation for why many things occurred in the early church is many women saw Thecla as the example that they wanted to pursue, that they wanted to model themselves after, of what a worthy Christian woman looked like and what a worthy Christian woman did. And so art that comes from the patristic era and into the Middle Ages, Thecla is widely part of Christian art in that era and is often shown with Paul as his student, as someone who listened, who learned, who was a disciple, and who then went forth and taught. So no one knows for sure what happened here, or anything about the details of Thecla as a real person, but a huge impact on the church. And so we see in the early part of the patristic era, there is a strong focus on individuals who model the gospel, who stand for the things that the church is teaching, and who suffer for that. Ignatius and Polycarp are martyred for the sake of the faith. Thecla suffers for the sake of the faith. We see a great deal of suffering in the early church and the expectation that this is part of being a Christian. That being a Christian is costly and difficult and not for the faint of heart. And so at the beginning of the 2nd century, this is the church.